Hello students, welcome to E-Pathshala. My name is Prerna Trehan and I'm an assistant professor at GGTST College, Punjab University, Chandigarh. In today's module, we shall be looking at the Marxist understanding of politics and power. When we study the Marxist approach to political theory, we realize the need to apply this theoretical background to the pragmatic, realistic and practical world of politics. In this module, we shall look at the various Marxist concepts and how they function in the real world, whether it focuses on what was envisaged by Marx and how it differentiates from the same. In the current module, we shall first look at the various approaches within the Marxist school of thought. Next, we shall be picking up the important concepts of relations and forces of production, which are extremely important in uncovering the foundations of Marxism. Next, we shall also be looking at the concept of class and class struggle and conflict, which is the basis of the Marxist theory. Moving on, we pick up on the ideas of alienation and commodity fetishism, which has made Marxism an extremely important theory. Lastly, we will also be looking at mode of production as a concept in Marxist idea. And in the end, we shall look at the Marxist theory of state and revolution and how the same differs in different sub-schools of Marxist approach. Marxism and the contemporary world. The word Marxism often invokes very specific kinds of imageries. Most of them are like romanticized description of communes or a stateless world, or even the iconic images of workers out on the streets. These are not just historically limited, but also in some sense try to reify the very complex and layered nature of the ideology and practice of Marxism. The Occupy Wall Street movement, which broke out in 2011 in New York, was one such instance when believers and readers of Marxism sat up and took notice. The very powerful symbols and imagery which this movement threw up was a strong reminder of the challenge which Marxism poses to the capitalist ideology, systems, and its structures. This would be a good departure into David Harvey's introduction to the Communist Manifesto written in 2008, and I quote, "We may not have the right, as Marx and Engels wrote in their preface to the 1872 edition, to alter what had even by then become a key historical document. We do have both the right and the political obligation to reflect upon and, if necessary, reinterpret its meanings, to interrogate its proposals, and above all, to act upon the insights we derive from it." Harvey, now with the collapse of the USSR and the subsequent turbulence in institutionalized Marxism, we may choose to believe that the ideas in Marxism hold no relevance now. Yet the conditions of capitalism today lead us again and again to the texts written by Marx and Engels. What are these conditions that we are talking about? The 2008 US economy meltdown was triggered by a domino effect on economies around the world. One such moment of crisis for the capitalist system. Ultimately, the state had to step in to bail out not just the private sector banks riddled with crippling dead loans, but it also had to stimulate the economy as such. This very act of the state was a regression on some of the fundamental capitalist edicts. That is, the invisible hand which controls the economy, a non-interfering limited state, and the self-correcting marketing system. Interestingly, one of its modest proposals for reform, that is the centralization of credit in the hands of the state, seems to be well on the way to realization, thanks to the collective actions of the US Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and other central banks of other leading capitalist powers in bailing out the world's financial system. The British also ended up nationalizing their leading ailing bank, that is the Northern Rock. So why not take up some of the other equally modest but wholly sensible proposals, such as free and good education for all children in public schools, equal liability of all to labor, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax to rid ourselves of the appalling social and economic inequalities that now surround us. Since late 2009, the eurozone crisis, the most visible of which has been the Greek government debt crisis, has been plaguing economies in the entire region. Closer home, the economic slowdown signals not only a failure on part of capitalistic economic structures, but also confirms a long-standing argument about the development of underdevelopment in the so-called third world countries. Thus, there seemed to be some merit in going back to certain critical ideas in Marx. Approaches to understanding Marxism. Now, there are several methods to approach the labyrinth of ideas which constitute Marxism. Firstly, one restrict themselves to only the study of what was written by Karl Marx himself as a pure sort of an exercise. On the other hand, one could also expand the study to include various Marxist writers and schools of thought who succeeded Marx, as well as derived from or interpreted his ideas. This could include the large tradition of Western Marxism, the Marxist-Leninist school, the Stalinist interpretation of Marx's ideas, Maoism, Trotskyism, structural Marxism, Marxist humanism, as well as Marxist feminism, to name a certain few. The second method to read Marx could be what is largely called the epistemological break within Marxist writing. The epistemological break in Marx suggests that chronologically there are two kinds of writings that Marx has produced. Firstly, there is the early or the young Marx or the humanist Marx with writings which are largely philosophical in core, such as the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. Next, late or the mature Marx marked more prominently with the publication of the German ideology, written again in 1844 and later in 1932. This text is seen as marking the break with the earlier kind of writing and giving way to economic analysis and the critique of capitalism that Marx is mostly known for. However, there are intense debates surrounding this method of classification of Marx's writings, since it is difficult to delineate when one text was written and the gap in its publication. Marx began writing at a time when much of the intellectual debate centered on Hegel. A group called Young Hegelians had started responding to Hegel's works within a decade of his death. Marx was a part of this group. It was in this early stage of his work what Marx proposes his theory of alienation and the concepts like dialectical materialism. Hegel believed that there is a dialectical progression of history whereby an original idea exists called the thesis. Over time, opposition to this idea develops in the form of antithesis. The two are resolved through a process called synthesis, which then becomes a new thesis over time. Thus, over time, this new thesis shall again be opposed, the process of synthesis shall repeat itself, and history will continue to progress. Marx argued against Hegel's idea that ideas determine the course of history. Marx instead proposed that ideas have a material basis in economic and social conditions of a historically specific time and age. Unless these material conditions change, ideas and thus history cannot move ahead. In Marx, this is termed as historical materialism or dialectical materialism, the fact that history depends on material ideas for its movements. Economics then seems to be at a vantage point from where we can weave into rest of Marx's concepts. This is by no means suggesting that entire of Marx's thought can be reduced only to an economic analysis. In fact, it refers to Althusser's famous interpretation that economy only determines in the last instance. Economy in Marx is intrinsically linked to the idea of human beings being marked with the capacity of production. Human beings are not just rational creatures, rather, they are creative beings who can produce and imagine and enjoy the fruits of their labor. This creativity thus also means that human beings as a species being are capable of shaping their own nature and history. Next, we explore the idea of relations and forces of production. Every epoch in history has a specific set of forces of production, which include means of production like machines, animals, equipment, and labor power. Technological advancements cause a change in these forces of production, and thus they continue to be historically specific. So, for instance, in a historical age where the task of energy generation was done by bullocks encircling a well, the level of industrial or agricultural option would be significantly low. As the forces of production change, say bullock carts are now replaced by wind energy, the style and rate of industrial production shall also change. Relations of production refer to who owns the forces of production and who is working with these elements. The relations between the master and slave in a slave society, or between a landowner and a serf in a feudal society, would be examples of relations of production. The movement from one mode of production to the other happens when there is a contradiction between relations of production and the forces of production. Next comes the idea of class and class conflict. Now, according to Marx, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, is a central concept for understanding Marx's analysis of capitalist society. History moves forward because of this class struggle caused by the contradiction between relations and forces of production. While Marx argues that struggle between classes has been a feature of all epochs in history, in this particular stage of capitalism, class struggle has become extremely polarized between only two classes, that is, those who own the means of production and those who only own their labor power. The other classes have mostly been forced to enter the class of workers. Some of them may also have entered the class of factory owners, or at least the petty bourgeois. Ownership of the means of production or lack of such ownership then becomes the criteria for determining one's class position. Thus, for those who own means of production will also have similar interests and positions. For instance, factory owners will want longer working weeks, low minimum wages, and easy access to raw material in order to maximize profit. This makes the factory owner a class in itself, the bourgeois. Similarly, there is also a class of workers who are interested in shorter working weeks, higher wages, and easy access to basic resources. This not only makes them a class in itself, the proletariat, also makes them come into direct opposition with the bourgeois. A class in itself becomes a class for itself when the members of this group become aware or conscious of their similar interests. Class consciousness is an important element in Marx's understanding of class struggle and finally revolution. Only a class for itself has consciousness enough to fight for itself. In the history of capitalism, when the proletariat become a class for itself, it will lead a revolution against the bourgeois. Marx also studies the role of hegemonic rule of the bourgeois over media, knowledge, and political practices. Ideology thus becomes false consciousness. According to Marx, the exploited classes actually do not realize that they are being exploited due to the hegemonic control of the bourgeois on ideas, knowledge, and even consciousness. The next idea that we go on to is alienation and commodity fetishism. According to Shefali Jha, and I quote, taking seriously the Hegelian idea that individual freedom was the result of specific social conditions, Marx concluded that the modern social conditions exemplified by the capitalist mode of production were antithetical to freedom. End quote. Perhaps the highest manifestation of this loss of freedom is explained in Marx through the concept of alienation, commodity fetishism. Marx writes in economic and philosophical manuscripts, labor not only produces commodities, it also produces itself and the workers as a commodity, and it does so in the same proportion in which it produces commodities in general. Marx here means that the product of labor becomes alien to those who produce it, to the one who labors. The product of labor objectifies labor and its owner, the worker, itself as an object. Marx further continues that in the sphere of political economy, this realization of labor appears as a loss of reality for the worker, objectification as loss of and bondage to the object, and appropriation as estrangement, as alienation. Thus, what does it mean for labor to be objectified? Naomi Klein, in her book No Logo, talks about her visit to a garment sweatshop in Jakarta around 1997, where a labor strike against longer working hours and an abysmal pay scales had just been concluded. Klein uncovers creation of jackets by Asian women, a product that they did not understand as they did not need it, and also for Canadians who did not realize where these clothes were being created. Thus, what these women are producing is alienated from them or is made alien to them at numerous different levels. Firstly, there is alienation from labor. Second, alienation from the product of labor. Third, alienation from the society and the fellow workers. And lastly, alienation from themselves as humans. Workers in a capitalist society rarely create an entire commodity on their own. More importantly, they never get to see the finished product of their labor increasingly due to the popularity of assembly line production or the increased level of footloose capital and labor. Importantly, the worker may also not be able to actually ever afford the product of his or her own labor. The workers cannot possess the product which their own labor produced. This therefore alienates the human beings from themselves. Ultimately, all social relationships are turned into economic exchanges even between workers themselves. This is what blocks class consciousness and does not let a class for itself develop. Commoditive fetishism is an advanced stage of this phenomena where the exchange value of commodities begins to override use value. Further, even though exchange value is an indicator of the amount of labor that has gone into making of the commodity, under commodity fetishism, this commodity acquires a life of its own, independent of the labor which has produced it. Commodities acquire an exchange value, or rather a value per se, only because of what they will fetch in the capitalist market. Ultimately, labor power, that is the capacity of the labor, itself becomes a commodity which is bought and sold in the market depending on its exchange value. Now, because this labor power cannot be separated from the human being who carries this labor power, human beings and their relationships also become commodities and are thus alienated. Capitalist mode of production, profit, and exploitation. Apart from being alienated, workers are also exploited. This exploitation arises from a basic distinction, whether you own the means of production or whether you are selling your labor. The bourgeois, because they own means of production, force the proletariat to sell their labor and extract a surplus out of that labor. In return for his or her labor, the worker gets a wage. For Marx, the surplus value is the difference between the value a worker produces and the value of his labor. The value of labor power is calculated by the amount of labor which goes into producing it. Now, the capitalist actually makes the worker's labor for much more than this cost. The worker thus labors for much more than the cost of his or her basic existence. This difference between what is paid and how much value is extracted from the worker is what constitutes surplus for the bourgeois. This surplus value is then accumulated as profit. This surplus value is also the basis for exploitation of the workers. Marx's theory of state and revolution. State in Marx is an instrument in the hands of the ruling class. Marx says, and I quote, "The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeois. Through obfuscation of ideology and through hegemony, the ruling class keeps the state as an extension of itself. This is why, for any revolution to take place, it is essential that the revolutionary class captures the state." For Marx, the roots of revolution lay in the struggle between classes. The bourgeois, according to Marx, was the original revolutionary class trying to break free from feudal control and leading to the establishment of mercantile capitalism. In the course of history, however, this class loses its revolutionary potential and becomes the dominant hegemonic bourgeois that we know of today. The progress of history, as well as the contradiction between forces and mode of production, will eventually force capitalism to begin contradicting itself. With an increasing class consciousness about their conditions, at this point in history, the proletariat or the working class would take over the state through a revolution and establish dictatorship of proletariat. Under the rule of the proletariat, called state socialism, the bourgeois institution of private property will be abolished. Division of labor will cease to exist, along with other instruments of state power. Slowly, the state will wither away, and in its place, a communist society, stateless and classless, will be formed. However, Marx's idea of state has been much discussed. One other strand in the debate is on the state being a capitalist instrument, whereas the other strand is with respect to the relative autonomy of the state. The discussion on passive revolution also features in this set of arguments. Antonio Gramsci first proposed that in a capitalist society, the only way to bring about revolution would be through a passive mode. Institutions like civil society would aid in this through the process of organic change. In Selections from Prison Notebooks, Gramsci argues that while France went through a ruptural revolution, other European countries did not do so, but instead went through a passive revolution in which the old feudal aristocracy was not destroyed, but compromises were made between the rising industrial class and the aristocracy. Nikos Poulantzas and Ralph Miliband have engaged in a debate about the nature of the capitalist state. In The State and Capitalist Society, published in 1969, Miliband argues that the state serves capitalist interests because of the social origins of the members of the state government is roughly from the capitalist class. Poulantzas, in his review of the work of Miliband, critiqued Miliband, claiming that state in itself is a capitalist entity and does not need external influences like a networked class to make it work for capitalism. The state will be capitalist even if we change who runs the state. Miliband responded to this argument by claiming that Poulantzas' model leaves no room for agency of individual actors who could possibly affect the way in which the state behaves. Indian Marxists like Pranav Bardhan have argued that the state in India was relatively autonomous because of the relative strength of all competing classes were roughly equal. Thus, while the classes wrestled with each other, the state was left relatively autonomous to carry forward its own agenda. Thus, the state in India did not become an instrument of any class. Partha Chatterjee also worked on the idea of passive revolution and argues that the Indian state was largely autonomous of the bourgeois as well as the landed elites. He writes about the characteristics of passive revolution in India, and I quote, "The supervision of the state by an elected political leadership, a permanent bureaucracy, and an independent judiciary, the negotiation of class interests through multi-party electoral system, a protectionist regime discouraging the entry of foreign capital and promoting import substitution, the leading role of the state sector in heavy industry, infrastructure, transport, telecommunications, mining, banking and insurance, state control over the private manufacturing sector through a regime of licensing, and the relatively greater influence of industrial capitalists over the central government and that of the landed elites over the state governments. The contemporary nature of the state thus differs significantly from Marx's original idea due to factors such as post-colonialism, mixed economic models, and the lack of a clear transition from feudalism to capitalism in much of the world outside the pockets of Europe. In conclusion, it is important that while the Cold War years are usually considered to be the high point of ideology, the two dominant ideologies of communism and capitalism in this time came in direct confrontation and the debate was intense. Along with much of Latin America and China, the USSR provided a formidable challenge to the ideology of capitalism, or at least to the idea of hegemonic monoistic interpretation of the world. The end of the Cold War and the apparent triumph of capitalism heralded the end of ideology. From now on, there was seen as no gap between ideology and capitalism. Ideology had become redundant in favor of capitalism. The end of the Cold War was not simply the apparent triumph of capitalism, it was actually the loss of alternatives. In a short span of little more than 20 years, capitalist ideas have become normalized, so much so that a Cuba or Iran begin to appear as an aberration, a rather evil one at that. The world is still perhaps not unipolar in terms of ideology, but has rather been split into the normal and the abnormal. Yet there is resistance. The Occupy Wall Street movement was one such crack in the otherwise flawless montage of Western capitalism. The intense opposition to developmental projects in India like POSCO, Niyamgiri and Narmada Valley hint towards a multipolar ideological world, but this kind of development has not been found acceptable. It is here that Marx's idea of surplus extraction has led to the idea of accumulation by dispossession, of primitive accumulation, and to an understanding that development and decent working conditions are not antonyms. Let us now try to summarize whatever has been studied within this module. What we understand is that despite the fall of communism in USSR and Marxism becoming irrelevant in world politics, Marxism as an ideology continues to offer alternative space of protest and resistance to liberal and capitalist ideals. The various notions evolved within the Marxist notion of politics are extremely relevant even today. When we study the ideas of historical materialism, relations and forces of production, alienation, commodity fetishism, we see them in various forms throughout the world, be it in sweatshops in Jakarta or in the beedi clins of India. In today's scenario, the ideas of passive revolution and relative autonomy of state as developed by various schools of Marxist thought are extremely important in uncovering the varied nature of state in Marxist theory. Furthermore, the ideas of ideology and hegemony are extremely relevant in uncovering the lack of a worker-led revolution and why the same hasn't been possible despite being envisaged by Marx in his theory. The Marxist understanding of politics and power is extremely varied as well as nuanced. The study of the same is extremely relevant to gather a developed and holistic view of political science. Thank you.